Welcome to this session of the StateRAMP Exchange. My guests today are Ken Weeks, the Chief Information Security Officer for the state of New Hampshire, and Charles Rote, the Deputy CISO for the state of Maine. Ken, Charles, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me, Jason. Appreciate it.
We continue our conversation about this thing called StateRAMP. I've been following the FedRAMP part of it since, it feels like 2011, and 15 years pushing now. And what we've seen over the last decade plus is this really move to understand the value of a program like StateRAMP, but also the value of understanding the standards and the pieces and parts that come with the putting vendors through the standard certification effort. And that's where we're going to start with this move towards modernization and why these standards are so important. But let me start with Ken. Ken, in the state of New Hampshire, let's discuss your cloud strategy. What are you looking at around moving toward more applications, workloads to the cloud, and of course, as part of your digital transformation efforts?
Certainly, Jason. When I first got to the state about 3 years ago, we sort of had this catchphrase called Cloud Smart, right? And so we would move workloads to the cloud if it made sense to do so, was more efficient, or there was a compelling need, like something we were doing on-prem needed significant modernization, et cetera. But very quickly that strategy changed and is not quite to a cloud first, but is getting there as agencies modernize and get rid of technical debt through custom applications that have been maintained over the years. And so we're seeing a mass migration, if you will, of applications that we used to host on-prem in our 2 data centers to the cloud environment. And that makes something like StateRAMP really important to us.
The state of Maine is following a similar trajectory with regards to its architecture principles. I would say we're probably closer to a cloud smart level right at this point, as opposed to a cloud first application. But it allows us to do all manner of things and not only build capability rapidly and efficiently with the right partners, but at scale. And if ideally we could do it at a less expensive for less, that protects state tax dollars, and that's always good for business in the state government.
I'm really interested that you both brought up Cloud Smart and Cloud First, obviously terms that we say started with the federal government and some of the folks at the Office of Management and Budget and in the White House. But if you think about the federal side, they started with Cloud First and then moved to Cloud Smart. It seems like you are flipping around. Maybe Ken, talk a little bit about why that flip is happening. Why is this Cloud First really the driving, overarching strategy?
Yeah. So for us, Jason, it has a lot to do with maintaining data centers and keeping data centers modern, and the expense that goes into that from a power, space, and cooling standpoint, modernizing spaces, and having enough staff to do all of the necessary just hygiene things, security updates, application updates, et cetera, et cetera. So I wouldn't say that we've gone completely to cloud first, but the idea is to host as little on-prem and have as few remaining custom applications as we can. Our workforce is aging. Most of the ladies and gentlemen that wrote that code are retirement eligible, and it was written in languages that, quite honestly, are just not easy to modernize, right? So instead of starting from a blank screen and an editing window, we're looking for more and more commercial products that can be hosted with managed service, both from a cloud hosting environment as well as the applications themselves.
Yep. So in addition to Ken, I would suggest that Maine is in the same boat. It may even be worse. The fact of the matter is that Maine is one of the oldest states in the union per person, and we're really struggling we have great talent on hand, but being able to attract and retain new and younger talent to maintain data centers is problematic. One of the things that Ken may have not touched on is, and alluded to it with his modernization, but by transitioning to a cloud environment, oftentimes if you have the right partner, it causes you to be more disciplined in how you manage that environment. So applications can't be exceptionally old to operate in these cloud environments. So that pushes some of the application development and our infrastructure folks to be more modern, more current, and maintain the security at an appropriate level.
Charles, you bring up a really important point, and this is really what we're getting to in this conversation is the security side of it. When you have something like a StateRAMP program, when you're able to kind of lean on a certification process, and again, this could be StateRAMP, but also could be NIST standards, it could be ISO standards, CMMI. There's a host of them I'm sure you all are much more familiar with than I am. What does that mean for that environment, and what does it mean for kind of relieving some of that pressure on the workforce?
Yep. So with regards to maintaining the security assurances, we use a risk-based approach for determining what assurances is allowable for a particular cloud service provider solution. And we work with them to protect our data, the CIA, the confidentiality, integrity, availability of the data at an appropriate level to what we're using in that solution. The importance of the security assurances is we only select certain assurances for those most critical data sets or those most critical business functions. And by doing so, by selecting only the best of those credentialing, it alleviates a lot of burden on our information security office, which may not have the appropriate personnel and the appropriate time to do the assurances. But also, oftentimes, if you're not leveraging these third-party audits and results, the solutions can be a bit of a black box to you. So you're not necessarily doing your due diligence to make sure that what you're putting in that environment is truly safe.
So I think Charlie brings a great point about the due diligence and the third-party audits. That's one of the most important pieces that comes with a program like StateRAMP. So here in New Hampshire, for example, we're fortunate that we took a look into the crystal ball and guessed properly and sort of aligned our policy and procedure with the same set of NIST standards that StateRAMP currently operates under. And so by doing that, when we select a vendor or give a preference to a vendor who's gone through the StateRAMP process, we know that not only have they met the same security standards and controls that we impose upon ourselves at the state, but they've been verified by somebody else. And it's no longer the situation of just taking somebody's word for it. We have a trusted third party, both from the auditing documents that are submitted to StateRAMP, as well as the StateRAMP program management office that's reviewing all those in great detail before we select a vendor and start doing business with them. Because at the end of the day, we're assuming their risk whenever we sign a contract and begin to provide government services with their product.
Yeah, that's great. One of our architecture principles is that the state of Maine is a single enterprise. And when we onboard these cloud service providers, they become a part of the larger whole of our network. And there has to be an inherent level of trust associated with that. We were lucky too. We saw the tea leaves and the writing on the wall that NIST standards were the way to go. And utilizing cloud service providers at the various impact levels that they're set at, low, medium, high, or whatever lexicon they're using for determining those security levels, that translates well and enables you to deploy capability at an efficient rate with the right partners.
I want to talk a little bit about that due diligence, those using those third-party audits. One of the benefits of a StateRAMP program, FedRAMP, any of the audits is getting that peace of mind. I'll throw it out to either of you, Ken or Charles. Have you looked at the time savings, the cost avoidance? How are you, if you will, measuring the impact of using a program like StateRAMP versus doing it yourself or using only a part of it? Meaning, well, we'll start with company X that went through the process, but we're going to do more due diligence on them, or we're going to go deeper and not necessarily, quote unquote, trust the process.
So I think that you hit on many of the pertinent points, Jason. When I first took this job 3 years ago, the state wasn't doing a very good job at looking at these in any way, shape, or form. There was sort of a matrix, in the request for proposal process, and it was really however the vendor answered the question, right? They could just say yes, and that was as far as it went. No evidence was necessarily required, et cetera. And so that's the kind of thing that should make most people sort of have a little bit of an eye twitch, right? So I instituted a process where I was trying to replicate a StateRAMP-like process myself. And as a single individual, we would request all of this information from vendors. Then I would take a look at it, make some judgment calls, have my team do a little bit of research, my very small team of 3. And it was just completely absorbing us with the amount of business that a state government does. So having a repeatable process through StateRAMP or FedRAMP that aligns with the standards that our policies and procedures are written to anyway has been a lifesaver for me. And with StateRAMP, one of the fortunate things is they recently implemented a tiered structure for the fees that a vendor has to pay. If you're a smaller company, you don't pay as much as a great big company, for example. And that was very helpful for us to guide some of our vendors, people that we had business with, to StateRAMP, because it made it affordable for them. And, get certified once, use it many times, both here in the region as well as nationwide. It turns out to be a benefit for them, because the last thing that I was going to be allowed to do as the CISO is strangle small businesses in the state of New Hampshire. So we had to have a process that the small businesses in the state of New Hampshire could also take advantage of.
In the state of Maine, there are 2 major advantages that we in the state have utilizing StateRAMP instead of just relying on FedRAMP. The first is that in the case of StateRAMP, we have actual access to the audit results. So we can see where a lot of the deficiencies are from a state perspective. The other thing is that we're able to leverage vendors that may not be qualified to conduct a FedRAMP certification. So to Ken's point with regards to potentially smaller businesses, not only do they have StateRAMP, which is available to them even if they're not doing business with a federal entity, but also there's the StateRAMP snapshot, which allows a vendor to do that initial preliminary assessment of where they are. And if it's looking positive for a new enterprise, then perhaps you want to make a bet with that organization or a partnership with that organization to get them to full StateRAMP certification. And while that's in process, you're actually doing business with them, which makes them become more of a viable company. So there's a lot of good channels in and out of the StateRAMP certification. So in the state of Maine, we utilize for our higher levels of business functions or critical data sets, StateRAMP, FedRAMP, SOC 2 Type 2 with appropriate trust principles. And all of those are in high trust. We're looking at high trust now, but there's a lot of nuances between those, but StateRAMP is a great way for us to onboard cloud capabilities in a secure manner.
One of the things, Charles, you said I want to go back to is it allows us to access the audit results. And I think one of the challenges, and I think both you and Ken pointed this out, is it's easy to be overwhelmed by audit results, and you don't have big teams. What are some when you're looking at those audit results? And I know every cloud instance is different, every vendor is different, but are you looking at maybe some specific things? Okay, how do they address incident response? How do they address data at rest, data in transit? What are you kind of looking for that shines a kind of bright light on that you say, okay, that's a good thing, I want to know about that? Can you sum it up?
Yeah, absolutely. So it really depends on the capability that we're trying to fill. So if the business cannot go without this technology for more than 10 minutes, then we're probably looking closer at the contingency planning, security control families. But even though you're looking at an entire audit packet, really you're able to focus on the exceptions. And that's what's great about these third-party audits. Yeah, you have this, you have this, you have this. So you can quickly go through all of those security and privacy controls to determine like, yep, all right, you meet our level of assurance in these areas. Now let's talk about the exceptions. How are we going to move forward? What have you done in the meantime? And by having that dialogue with your vendors, you're furthering that assurance of security for your stakeholders.
Yeah. And I would add to what Charlie said right there is that a lot of StateRAMP has a lot of different committees, right? As a nonprofit organization, they have a lot of folks who are very highly qualified that perform duties on these committees. I don't remember, Charlie, offhand if you're on any of the committees, but for full transparency here, I happen to be on the StateRAMP Approvals Committee. And so as Charlie talks about looking at audit packages, the StateRAMP PMO goes through and evaluates and takes notes and gives grades and points out these exceptions that Charlie talked about. And then there's a group of state government employees that come in for the approvals committee who are risk managers, security officers such as myself, and then review those results. And in many cases, that's what will get a product certified, StateRAMP certified. So knowing the level of detail that goes into the analysis, knowing the expertise of the folks that serve on the standards committee, for example, that are going to look at all the control families and make the determination of what it takes to be StateRAMP moderate, completely covered by StateRAMP. That's not the technical term, but I think you know what I mean. If you've had the full-on scrubbing, you've had a lot of eyes looking at data provided by the auditors. And so you can be pretty confident that at least at that point in time, and each subsequent year when it gets renewed, that risk is being managed in a responsible way.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're looking for that continuous monitoring element that we get through StateRAMP and the SOC 2 Type 2s, so that you're having that consistent look that's going on, even though instead of just, yep, we vetted this product, we've implemented this product. So now we're getting to the point with these security assurances that we're able to maintain that security assurance or that faith that they're doing the right thing as the relationship continues throughout the life cycle of the relationship.
Yeah, and that really kind of squares the circle on, did you do it yourself? What do you really save? Because when I was doing it myself, Jason, there was no way I had the cycles to go back and do any kind of a revisit, let alone something that could remotely be classified as continuous.
I hear that term, the continuous monitoring. It's so important to understand because today they're great, but tomorrow they may not be. So you got to always know that update's coming. Are there instances when you're looking at StateRAMP and where you say to yourselves, they meet 80% or 90% of what we need, but we're going to ask them to go that other 10 or 20%? And if there are, which I assume there are, how often does that happen? Or is it really, most of the time, solid 90-95% of the time out of the box works great the way it's the audit and the level of security? Ken, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure thing, Jason. If they're StateRAMP certified, we in New Hampshire at least, we're taking that as good to go, if you will. You've got the stamp of approval, okay to sign that contract. Now let's negotiate terms, right? But we're satisfied from a security standpoint about doing business with that company for that product. I think it's important to point out that just because a product from a company is StateRAMP certified or FedRAMP certified, that doesn't mean the company is. It's just that product. So you have to make that distinction, and you also have to make a distinction between the product and the hosting environment, because you can take a certified product and host it at Joe's Chicken Shack and web hosting, and you've kind of defeated the purpose of having a StateRAMP certified product. So in New Hampshire, we look at both the hosting environment as well as the product itself. Even though where it's hosted is part of the audit, that might be the one additional thing that we ask, is that you're also hosting in a FedRAMP or StateRAMP certified hosting environment.
Yeah, the great thing about leveraging FedRAMP for anything that's holding our federal regulatory compliance requirements is that the federal government approaches certifications of cloud services in a similar fashion to the way that Ken explained, being accepting of the StateRAMP certifications. So it expedites our ability to migrate data from the federal government that's been shared with us that is essential to us conducting our businesses. And in fact, with a cloud service provider, these disparate federal entities tend to accept that single baseline. Say you have a number of federal entities that are dealing with a moderate data set. The preponderance of those federal entities all will accept typically a FedRAMP moderate like certification.
Right.
However, when it's on-prem and you're dealing with each one of these federal entities in isolation, they tend to pile on all these extra requirements on the state in their compliance regimes. And it can be problematic, and it's a significant burden that they're placing on the states by not having these standardized baselines for standardized data sets and risk levels.
Charles, that's an excellent point. And because, Federal News Network and a lot of our audience are federal employees too, let's talk a little bit about that, because they probably don't realize the burden they're placing on states like yours, like Maine and New Hampshire. So dig a little deeper on that. So if you're working with, and we'll pick on Labor Department, unemployment insurance, because that's a big system. We know it's going through a modernization, and you have your systems on-prem, they may say, hey, not only do we need NIST 853 Rev 5, but we need 10 other things or 20 other things. But if you're in a X, you pick the platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, provide one of the big CSPs, and they're FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP high, they may say, good to go. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very granular too. So for example, federal entity A has a session timeout time of X, and B is this, and C is that. Well, that's all great, because people will say, well, just do the high watermark, right, for your access control. Where it can become even more problematic is where you have controls that are set at the high level, because some federal entity thought that, oh, well, this is important for this data set, even though the data sets are consistent, which places a financial and a personnel and a talent burden on the states to implement. Similarly, they're not all moving at the same time. In fact, some federal entities have transitioned to NIST 850 Rev 5, which has the more modernized password regimes, while other federal entities are still telling you to change your passwords every 90 days. Now, I've never had a relationship shut down because of those controls, but it's problematic when you have auditors like, why aren't you changing your passwords? Well, because we're using Azure, and it's checking those passwords against a known bad checklist. And it has been found that passwords, if you're changing them routinely, is not good. It's not good for security, et cetera, et cetera. We're pretty familiar with the password regime, but some are in the past and some are in the present, where as if you're dealing with FedRAMP or StateRAMP, the playing field is level in those areas where there is a single baseline for that. And some of it's not the federal entity's fault, really, in that some of them are mired in some pretty obscure law that they have to contend with. And I don't want their job. But while I appreciate the pain points that they're experiencing when establishing security baseline for states, the differentiation between those does cause us heartache.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Charlie just said there. And I know, Jason, that you spoke with Doug Robinson, the executive director from NASCIO, and one of NASCIO's federal advocacy priorities is sort of this leveling and of all of the federal standards for auditing and regulated data, right? Because as Charlie says, depending on the agency, you have a whole different set of controls that you have to meet, and some of them are just specific to that agency. And so it would be much easier from a state standpoint, if you didn't have to start with a blank sheet of paper every time, and you could just say, these are the systems. For example, this is our workflow for the things that are in scope for your audit, and things are StateRAMP compliant, or FedRAMP compliant, or NIST 53 R5 compliant. And as Charlie pointed out, just recently for New Hampshire, we had audits that occurred pretty close on the calendar, where one agency had transitioned to Rev 5, which is what our state's based on. And so that's what our policies look like, but it's very different than their auditing checklist. And so we spent hours and hours and hours going, but wait, ours is better because it's more modernized, right? You don't want us to go back to this weaker thing to protect your data, do you? So those will be really important efforts. And we understand that it's, sort of sweeping back the tide with the broom, but any progress that we collectively make on that between the federal agencies and the state governments will be time well spent.
I hear the same challenges with auditors in the federal sector too. You all are not alone. You should know that. There's a lot of people who feel the same challenges with saying to them, hey, I know that the policy says X, but we went X plus one. Even though the policy doesn't say it, we're doing better. And there's that back and forth that happens. So I know it can cause a lot of frustration and a lot of time, as Ken, you pointed out, take hours and hours and hours to talk about it. Want to go forward just on go back to StateRAMP just real quick. One of the things when we talk about StateRAMP is the workforce challenges. You all mentioned that briefly. I just want to hit upon the idea that because you're using StateRAMP or FedRAMP or similar standards, how is that helping the workforce? How is it helping you deal with the fact that getting cybersecurity workers who are trained, who are up to date, is a challenge for every organization? Ken, why don't you lead off?
Sure. What we did here in New Hampshire is we completely rewrote the instructions in the language in the request for proposal process, right? Because it's one thing to talk about cybersecurity experts that are in my group, but where it's even more lacking is when you get out into the agencies that are actually delivering government services to the population, right? I have little, they have none. So as they're procuring systems and cloud services to deliver those, their government mission, they have no idea what a security standard looks like. That's not pejorative. That's not what they do. You wouldn't want me assessing the cleanliness of your drinking water, right? So by using this one standard and rewriting our language, all of the contract folks and the program managers in the agencies across the executive branch, they now have a very specific sort of yes/no check that they can look at, rather than trying to interpret a whole bunch of different criteria that are just, in an unreadable matrix. So they see that that one of the respondents to their request for proposal is StateRAMP certified. They know that's going to pass the security. They see it's FedRAMP, same thing, or high trust in our case, because a lot of health and human services use high trust. And high trust and StateRAMP have just, I'm not sure if that's quite over the hill yet, but are in the process of getting a reciprocity, so that if you have one, you have both. I know it's in the works. I'm not sure if that's finalized yet, but what it does is it simplifies for the agencies and all of the people who are experts in procurement but not security, to help get the security built in to the left of the procurement cycle, rather than trying to make up for it after we've bought something that's inherently not quite up to par. So it's not just in the security shop, Jason, I think is the point that I would make. It's across all of the agencies that are delivering government services, where there is a manpower savings and an exponential increase in expertise applied to security standards for those procurements and services.
Yeah, and by not partaking in these particular security audit regimes, vendors are discounting themselves. They're not even being considered in the queue in some of these procurements, simply because right on the label, you can tell that they may be doing the greatest work that they can on the back end. But without that validation, that sticker on the product, states are reluctant to accept that, especially in particular use cases where you have to have that level of security assurance. Jason, you were talking earlier about how you save time by not having an individual simply conducting these reviews themselves. But not only is it just saving that individual's time from like, yeah, I made it through the whole review and this vendor was good. More often than not, that individual will do all that work and find significant issues with the product. And so not only did they spend all that time doing this massive review of documentation, but in the end, it resulted in zero net gain, no improvement for the state from a business perspective. So that's a level of frustration in the workforce. And additionally, we're a centralized information technology support organization for our state entities. By having a third party looking at these vendors, then it takes out some of the, you're standing in the way. Look, I didn't say that this vendor wasn't up to snuff. We looked at the security levels of this product. The third party looked at that and they found these issues. Now, whether you're accepting of these risks is ultimately going to be up to you, but we're able to give recommendations based on what we're presented by using a third party.
Yeah. And if I could, Jason, I don't know if Maine has done this yet or not, but just recently we actually, I mentioned we updated the language in the RFP process, and what we did is we worked with our administrative services, the actual procurement folks, who are responsible and accountable for how that whole process works. And we've implemented a piece where if you're StateRAMP certified, and this gets to Charlie's comment about a vendor may not even be on the table, we give an absolute 15% scoring preference if your product is StateRAMP certified. And we break it down into the hosting environment and the product to avoid the, Joe's Chicken Shack and web hosting comment that I made earlier, right? So it has to be both, right? Yeah, the hosting environment and the product. But we just flat out say that to all the vendors. You will get a preference if you have these certifications.
And we're working to move a lot of those requirements left in the procurement process, like Ken is, so that we're completely transparent going into it. That here's our NDA. Do you accept this? What problems do you have with this? Here are our terms and conditions. Do you accept these? If you do not, what are they? And the more you can move those requirements to the left to include these security assurances. This requires StateRAMP certification. This product requires IRS Pub 1075 Exhibit 7 language in the contract, and on and on and on. If you load those up in the RFP, ideally it will shoo away those that aren't going to cut it and are just going to frankly waste your time. So you're able to better vet those. So by the time you do select a vendor and you're at contract, there should be no confusion once the contract is drafted.
Gentlemen, we have a few minutes left together. And before I let you go, I just want one question for both of you regarding the cloud is really as a means to an end, right? It's a tool to really improve digital services and digital services that are secure, trustworthy, and that are efficient. So maybe I'll start with Ken on this one and then come back to Charles. Talk a little bit about why, bring the conversation together and talk about how all this is really all about meeting the expectations of the citizens of your state. How is this part of this bigger strategy, the secure, efficient cloud services?
Yeah, so I think Jason, I'll just answer it as a citizen maybe instead of rather than as the state CISO, right? So I'm used to a certain digital experience in every aspect of my life, whether I'm shopping online, whether I'm getting a book from the library, all of those things, and I'm used to a certain level of experience. And that experience could be on my computer, on my phone, on my iPad, whatever it is, until I go to do business with the government, either locally or at the state, right? And so I think it's really about making government services and access to government services look and feel and react like every resident or business that does business with the state is used to doing with every other entity in their digital interactions. And I think a lot of state and local governments, and honestly, the federal government are behind in that. And so the move to smart cloud services and modern applications that look right when you get it on your phone instead of on a computer monitor, and are actually usable with someone with big thumbs like me, right? Those things matter, and it helps get the right services to the residents that we serve, and honestly, who need it the most. And that's what the digital transformation and moving to smart cloud services will do, is allow us to better serve our most vulnerable populations.
Yeah, absolutely. So the standard is definitely fast and easy. That's what people expect in every single nuance of their lives, except for, as Ken highlights, when they interact with the government. One thing I would add to that is that it's got to, and it may not even be mindful of a citizen, but it's got to be safe. And it becomes in the mind of the citizen once you start making headlines in a bad way on a daily basis with regards to their data. So we have to do what our due diligence in maintaining the security of the systems so that it's available when they want it and it protects the data that they're entrusting to us.
Gentlemen, I've very much enjoyed our conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time for this session. So let me thank my guests. Ken Weeks is the Chief Information Security Officer for the state of New Hampshire. Ken, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Appreciate it, Jason.
And Charles Rote is the Deputy CISO for the state of Maine. Charles, thank you as well.
Thank you, Jason.
I'm Jason Miller, and you're watching Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more from the StateRAMP Exchange.